All right, great. Well, welcome everyone. Hello. Lovely to see you all. My name is Hillary. I am a co-director of events at BPMA, where I volunteer. Also a product manager at Kickstarter for my day job. We also have Sandra on the line, who's also on the events team at BPMA. And I'm sure you'll see a couple of other BPMA faces here, but welcome. If it's your first time joining, we're just going to kind of introduce you to what BPMA is, and then shortly after that, in a few minutes, we'll kick it over to John, our speaker for today, to talk to us about B2B product discovery. So we are a professional association in the Boston area, and we really are focused on folks in the product space, whether you're a product manager, product marketing manager, you're product adjacent, you're a director of product, you're in leadership. And we try to provide a few offerings like these events to kind of keep people involved and engaged in the product community and build out a network and learn. So we do offer events like these. I'm going to share a slide next about a couple of upcoming events. We have a website with a blog component that has a lot of great product related content being churned out on a regular basis. We have a web team focused on content. We have a mentorship program and a job board. We've got a Slack community for members, and a couple of other benefits to know about. So definitely take a look at the website if you're not familiar with this is our first time, or if you want to get more involved, feel free to check that out. We do have a number of sponsors and partners. At the top here, you'll see our three key sponsors: Pragmatic Institute, NDT, or New Dimensions in Technology, and Product Board. So huge thank you to them to supporting us and making a lot of these events and offerings possible. And we've got a number of partners below that you can check out that are great resources for product jobs, learning about different elements of product management, etc. So definitely check them all out. We occasionally have folks from these sponsors and partners join us for events. Larry Kahn from NDT has joined for a number of events. He's been a speaker. He's joined the in-person events. So just a great couple of resources to check out. We do have 2 upcoming events. If you aren't aware, I just want to plug, so hopefully see some of you there. We have another virtual event coming up in December. Melissa Appel, who is involved in BPMA as a member and also involved in the Women in Product Boston chapter, will be talking about stakeholder buy-in and stakeholder alignment. So that'll be a virtual talk, free to attend. Just check it out on the website. And then we do have our first sort of informal networking night that we're going to be hosting on December 6th. This is for members. So if you are a member, just check your email from, I think, November 10th. We sent out a message about this with a link to register. It will be kind of limited space. I think we'll have around 30 to 40 people, but the intention here is we heard a lot of feedback about people wanting more regular in-person, informal networking nights to kind of meet other people in the Boston product space, talk about issues and challenges we're facing. So there'd be some small group discussion there and then some broader group networking and share outs. So yeah, definitely check that out, free for members. And that will be in the kind of downtown Boston area, likely. And then moving on to next year, we have yet to post events just yet, but we will have about 1 virtual event per month and the occasional in-person event too. If you have any ideas about events that you'd like to see, definitely let us know. There's a survey I'll pop in the chat at the end of this session to ask for your feedback. And one of the most important things we look for in that survey feedback is what you want to hear about, topics, themes, challenges you're encountering. If you are someone or you know someone who you think would be a good fit as a speaker, have an interesting product related topic to speak about, reach out. We'd love to talk to you and have you. So you can either drop a note about that in the survey or just reach out to me on LinkedIn. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn and let me know. But yeah, we're always looking for speakers and different topics to rotate in. So last note here before I kick it over to John, just some guiding principles. We definitely encourage cameras on if you're comfortable and you're not eating lunch. Just happy to kind of see faces and get to know people. We encourage networking. So in the Zoom chat, definitely share If you're comfortable, your name, your title, where you work or your school you're attending, where you're based. And if you want to share your LinkedIn and connect with people, great. And then ask questions in the chat as we go. John's given us the okay that as he's navigating through his slides, he's happy to welcome questions about specific, product discovery methods or other questions. So we'll be keeping an eye on that, myself and Sandra, and we'll call those out as we see them. All right, I'm going to kick it over to John. We'll swap slides now, if that's okay with you. But John is our speaker today. He's Director of Product at Broker Buddha, and he's going to talk to us today about some product discovery methods, things that have worked well for him, things that he's learned from. And yeah, just again, definitely share your questions in the chat. We want this to be engaging and make sure that we're all getting some value here. So thanks so much, and over to you, John.
All right, thanks, Hillary. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
And can you see a slide that says B2B product discovery, Hillary?
We can.
Great. So thank you again. My name is John O'Brien. As Hillary mentioned, I'm currently Director of Product at a company called Broker Buddha. And I'm here to talk to you about business-to-business product discovery. So if you can't attend the whole call, take nothing from us from this talk, the thing I would probably share up front is that interviews have been the most useful tool by far for me, probably followed by customer support tickets and then usability testing. But, remote interviews via the phone or via web share have been a key tool, and I've found to be the most useful. Both because I get a better understanding and a greater context for that understanding, but also because they're very useful internally as evidence to persuade stakeholders. So that's the executive summary. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, and then I'll talk about different things I have tried over the years. I'll probably wax into a bunch of stories as the best illustration of those things. And so feel free to interrupt or ask questions as we go. So currently, like I said, I work at Broker Buddha. I've been here for about a year now. Before that, I worked at a company called Wolters Kluwer, which is a large Dutch publishing company. I worked on insurance compliance research solutions. So a product called Dill's InSource was my baby. A couple other ones, but that was the biggest one. And that was aimed at insurance compliance professionals. So they work at insurance companies, and they have to make sure that insurance companies maintain compliance. We sold to insurance carriers. That's the term of art for the insurance companies in the industry. And that was a great product. I worked there about 11 years. Keeping with the theme of large Dutch publishing companies, prior to that, I worked at Reed Elsevier. There was typically research tools for scientists. So I worked on a product called Hazmat Navigator, which I'll talk a little bit about. Also Methods Navigator, Brain Navigator, a bunch of navigators. That was the nomenclature for how we named those products in that division at that time. So what is product discovery? So product discovery is the practice of trying to vet something before you start building it, right? So typically you're both trying to discover problems that you can solve, and then also validate the solutions that you've come up with. I think most folks now with agile methodologies, you don't quite, it's not a clean handoff, right? Like product discovery is usually continuous nowadays, or at least it should be. So I think that's fair. That said, it's best if you can get something before you even break ground on even the first sprint, because you'll know you're on the right path and you're less likely to have wasted time building something that nobody wants. I found this slide and I think it's pretty good. If you think about the continuous loop that I'm sure most of us are familiar with, where you're going from engineering to stakeholders to users and then back to engineering. Product discovery is you're trying to do more of the vetting with users up front before you release it into the real, the real agile loop. I think that's a fair way to think about it. And through that, you can discard a lot of ideas before you start development, because a lot of them you'll find a reason why you don't want to pursue them anymore. So now I'm going to start talking about different tools that I've used to try to do product discovery over the years. So surveys, I've used surveys a bit, but I find that usually they're problematic. So a story I'll share is the first product I worked on, that hazmat navigator product. It started with the remit to take a look at a book called Brederick's Handbook of Reactive Chemical Hazards, uh, which is this scientific book aimed at chemical engineers, chemists, where you can look up the dangers of using different chemicals. And the product used to be what's called chemical structure searchable on a platform at the company I worked at. Due to internal shifts, it was no longer available on that platform. So the division I worked for was like, can we make this into a product that would be a successful digital product? So I started with actually surveys to book purchasers who'd happened to purchase the book directly. That was the first, like, and those were all open-ended surveys in like printed surveys I actually mailed to them because that was the only way we could reach out to them at the time. And then I followed up with like a Survey Monkey survey to all of the users who used to subscribe to the product when it was on a different platform. I was careful to make sure that they were economic decision makers, some other stuff, so that they should be valid results. And then when they came back, they were very positive. So I was like, great, this is going to work out. We went through a process of launching the product, and we got some adoption from some of the larger companies and institutions in the world, Harvard, MIT, Roche, Dow Chemical, but that was it, right? I think that the survey, probably the population was biased in retrospect, but in addition, what I would say is like, you don't know what you don't know. So when I was talking to folks afterwards, trying to figure out what was going wrong, the vast majority of customers could get by perfectly fine with what are called material safety data sheets, right? This was a known issue going into it, but given the survey results and some of the earlier positive feedback, I was discounting it because I was like, well, but there's surely a market. I see these people in the survey. So I think surveys can be dangerous for that reason. They don't necessarily give you the deeper understanding that I've gotten from like interviews. So that's one thing I say about surveys. The other one is that I found that they often don't persuade internal stakeholders. For whatever reason, the higher executives that I've worked with, if you show them survey results, maybe they have the same skepticism I have. They're often just not persuaded, right? So if you come back to them with research showing that it should work, they're not persuaded. So since at least a good chunk of my job is trying to make sure the stakeholders are aligned, I end up not using surveys as much for that reason. Similar story. When I was working on that Nils InSource product that I was talking about, the competitor analysis indicated that our largest competitors had case law material. So I did a survey and I went through and I asked the users, which would add the most value, right? The second most popular thing from that survey was case law material. So I was like, this is great, right? I'll find a way. It'll be great. We added case law to the platform, and nobody bought it, right? Turns out the users really would like it, but the economic decision makers looked at the problem very differently. And I only figured that out later. And I probably would have figured it out sooner if I'd done more interviews and less surveys in that example. In terms of tools, I used to use SurveyMonkey. That was great. Right now I'm using Google Forms. We also use the Net Promoter Score that's built into Pendo. I've always wanted to use conjoint analysis, and every single time I've worked with market research professionals, they're like, use conjoint analysis. But every single time it's also been like $100,000 and we've never had the budget. So one of these days though. So next, contextual inquiry.
Hey,
Yes,
Dan, real quick, question in the chat. What is directional feedback?
directional feedback is, I'm using that term to mean like it's a gross metric, right? So like Net Promoter Score is, you ask people whether they recommend the product to other folks, right? And if they give you an 8 or a 9, that's in the plus column. And if they give you, I think it's at less 6 or less, that's a detractor. And you take the net, and that gives you the Net Promoter Score. So it's not useful for like, is this particular feature that we did good? Like, it doesn't directly tell you that. It also doesn't validate an upcoming product concept or help you discover new problems. But if a year ago your NPS was one way and then a year later your NPS is another way, that's useful that like you're going in the right direction, right? So it's sort of a gross metric that I do track, but it doesn't help me with product discoverability. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions, Hillary?
Not just yet.
All right. So contextual inquiry, this was hot for a while. Maybe it's not so hot now. Back in the day, what this was known as basically like watching people work. So you would go in, you would like sit with folks and try to watch how they, interact with your product and other products. The hope is that you're going to discover problems that you can solve that they're not articulating. So I actually like set up this with the largest insurer in the United States, like Zurich. I like did a whole thing and went on site to a bunch of different sites and watched them use our product for a couple of sessions, right? And nothing really came out of it. Like they use email before, they use like spreadsheets afterwards. I think the premise is supposed to be that like you see them like putting up post-it notes and you're like, I could put the post-it notes in the product or something like that. I don't know. But for me at least in my products, nothing really came out of it that I also could not have done with an interview. Like I do interviews sometimes where I say, what do you do right before using our product? And what do you do right after it? Or ask a different way, like, what is the output of your exercise? And then where does that go, right? But I have found that like between the cost of like flying out and arranging the time and going on site and all that jazz, like it's never been worth it for me. I think maybe if I was working on physical products, right, and I was like observing people like physically interacting in an environment, it might be more useful because I could be like, aha, they're right next to the soldering iron or something. But at least for digital products, I have not found it to be useful. In addition, now with like screen recording stuff, though that would typically be limited to my website, but I still feel like you get a lot of those insights. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't recommend. Yeah, go on, Hillary.
Sorry, question in the chat is this the same as observation?
Yeah, basically, it's just a fancy name for watching people work, taking notes on their work. Any other questions?
No, I also wanted to throw in, I wonder, John, if, so for example, I know at a recent company that I worked at, and then the current company I'm at, we've implemented some kind of heat mapping and screen capture tools that obviously exclude like PII about the user, but give you a sense of like observing how they use a site in real time, if that's something that you've used or heard about or would fall into this bucket in any way.
Yeah, it's a different bucket than this. I have used that, but that's usually if I get feedback that's discordant with the product, right? So somebody's like, I can't figure out how to save, then I'll go in and I'll try to understand, okay, what's going on, right? And then usually looking at the screen, one will have an intuition, like maybe the button's not prominent enough, or maybe we've hidden it, or maybe it fades into the background. And so then I might go in and look at a heat map to be like, yeah, we're putting it in like the worst area, right? Like this is the area where everybody looks on this screen. And I'm putting it over here, and that's like either counter to best practices, counter to the rest of the product, or just a bad idea. And so that I'll use it for that. But conversely, like again, it doesn't really help me understand like larger problems because it's the articulation is what gave me that indication, right? The heat map is just helping me solve it now. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Thank you.
All right. So customer support tickets. So another story, listening to your customer. I actually spent a year every week setting aside time to listen to customer care calls. So at Wolters Kluwer, you could the customer support desk, you could have the calls recorded. And so I would go in and like basically randomly pick calls to listen to. Uh, that I would not recommend. The most useful thing I got out of that was an awful lot of folks were, when their insurance was canceled, they were calling the number they found on the form. But the number they found on the form at the very bottom was the name of the people who printed the form, which was Wolters Kluwer. It was not their insurance carrier. So we were getting a lot of calls from people saying, I don't understand why you're canceling my insurance. I'm just a few days late, which is like a real waste of time. So I guess you could argue that there was a benefit because I went to the customer support people and I said, look, put something in ahead of time saying if you are calling because your insurance has been canceled, we are not your insurance carrier. Please hang up and call them, right? And then in fact, because a lot of the people who were calling were not native English speakers and were speaking Spanish, I had that in English and in Spanish. So I guess that did decrease the amount of customer care calls that came in. But in terms of like product discovery, not useful. That said, generally speaking, customer support tickets have always been useful for getting like feedback on what's not working and what's broken, right? And then also I can use them as evidence to support a product idea that we're pursuing. So like if I'm currently thinking of doing X and there's a bunch of people asking for X anyway, that's great evidence, right? Couple of things about that though is that and usually they're low hanging fruit, right? Usually they're small incremental improvements that you can make on the product, just because the nature of the feedback. One thing that's tricky about that though is that often customers will ask you to make an enhancement to make your product more like someone else's product, which I'm always wary of, right? Because I don't actually want my product to be the exact same as someone else's product. If I had everyone else's features and more, great, but I've never been in that situation where I can do that. Usually I have to really pick and choose the features I add. So I usually try to pick differentiating features that will ideally make it so that they need both products, but at the very least make it like that there's a different position than the other product. And so users are often trying to pull me towards like making something just like something else. So that can be tricky. The other thing that's tricky is that it's really easy to just pick out the tickets that you want to hear because they're supporting the course that you want to pursue. And so you got to be careful about that with customer support tickets. I'll pause. Any questions, Hillary?
Not that I see.
Okay. So user analytics, so they're good for understanding what's currently working. I usually use them to verify post release whether something's working. We currently use Pendo, which I highly recommend. But prior to that, you can use Google Analytics, which has got some limitations. But if you want some straight up analytics stuff, Pendo's a great solution for that. Again, I usually don't use it for discovering problems or even really validating solutions. There is a new thing from Pendo that's supposed to be able to do that, but I haven't really found the right way to use that. Whenever I've done testing on wireframes, usually it's been via customer interviews. So we'll call the customer, show them the screen, and even like screen share with them so that they can interact with it. But usually they're not high fidelity enough that people can like be unmoderated using them, right? And they would very easily get lost. So usually or one of the people who I work with is on the phone with the user, or I'm on with the user. So, and then so that leads to usability testing. So usability testing I found very useful for validating product concepts, not so much for discovering issues. I did do for Hazmat Navigator, actually, we did do like straight up on-site, usability testing. So we had an expert, Elizabeth Rosenzweig, who was great to work with, founded World Usability Day, like highly competent. We went on site to a chemical, I don't know what you call it, chemical engineering, chemists association, what have you, conference. We set up some like a little mini lab thing, and she like observed people using it, and we could prove that the product was more usable than some alternatives. It was great, but it also cost like, I don't know, 15,000. It was cost a lot of money, right? And at the end of the day, just being more usable does not necessarily make, your product work, your product sell and be successful in the market. So I wouldn't do that again either. Going into a lab, they have these labs, particularly at Bentley, where you can like track people's eyes and stuff. So it's supposed to be better than the heat tracking you were talking about, Hillary. But I just feel like I'm very skeptical if the money is worth it for that. I have found remote usability testing, though unmoderated, to be well worth the money. For like $50, you can ask someone to go through and complete some tasks on your website. So I found that very, very good. For the reasons I alluded to earlier, I haven't gotten comfortable with usability testing wireframes with that, but I have used it I've used it in production. I haven't used remote unmoderated usability testing for short of production yet. I've only done that with moderated user testing. So like we have, again, me or a product manager on the call walking through the product in a lower environment with somebody. I used to use usertesting.com. That got really expensive. So now I use something called Playbook UX, which I recommend. Any questions on that?
Yeah, we had a couple questions in the chat. When you decide to go with a software tool like Pendo for NPS or user analytics or other tools for any other purpose, like product discovery, usability testing, etc., Sorry, it's a bit long. How do you assess the costs/subscription fees for those tools, and how do you convince your stakeholders to invest in those tools? I'm guessing this may be a challenge in every company, especially when you have to use a bulk of external software/APIs. So how do you work around that if the stakeholders say no? Great question.
Yeah, great question. So the first company at Wolters Kluwer, it was a real pain. So my boss did not believe in usability. And so convincing him that understanding how our users use the product better would be useful was challenging. So in that circumstance, what I did was I went through and I would talk to all the stakeholders. So I talked to sales about how they could use the information, and we would make it available in Salesforce. And it was going to be great. And then I went through and methodically like tested out all these scenarios where we'd be able to use the information and make better decisions. And so that is how I had to do it. And it took like a year. At the current company I'm working at, when I walked in, they were like, we have no idea how people are using our products. And I was like, I have a solution for that. So it took like 30 days. So it really depends upon the environment you go into, right? It's tricky on a straight up numbers basis because you can't prove additional revenue or reduce costs off of it, right? But I just hard to. I'm passionate about it because like if you're a product person, like that it's like the old marketing, that some parts of your product are not being used, but you're not sure which, right? And so with Pendo, you can actually see whether they're really using it or not. So when you're making product decisions, you should make better product decisions, right? Like we have to cut stuff. If I can go in and so one of the things versus Google Analytics that Pendo can do is Pendo, you can actually tag stuff anytime after the epoch, anytime after the system was implemented, and it will go back and tell you whether that feature was used. So without Pendo, what it looked like is we would have to go in, we'd have to tell engineering we want usage on a specific feature. We'd have to wait for that to come up, which like never happened because we always had more important stuff to do. And then when it did get tagged, we'd have to wait, right, for the usage information to come in off that feature we just tagged. So we would just flying blind, right? We would really make it based off any data. With Pendo, I can tag it, and then a few minutes later, it'll go back and look at all the prior events that were untagged and retag them, and then tell me whether anybody's using that feature, right? Now, just because people are using it doesn't mean it's valuable, and just because they're not using it doesn't mean it's not valuable. It certainly is a useful thing to know, right? So anyway, I don't know if that directly answered your question, but that's how I justified it.
Yeah. We have one other question, which I think is also a good one. Curious if usability testing is part of the discovery process. Different companies look at when they do usability testing, when UX comes into play, which is after discovery.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I'm doing moderated usability testing on wireframes, I would consider that part of the discovery process because I can do that pre the engineering starting, right? So typically, one of the ways to think about that is when I'm doing an interview with a customer or user may not speak the language I speak. So if I talk about requirements, they may not get it, right? I may not have a lot of confidence that they're really understanding what I'm talking about. But if I embody the requirements in wireframes, right, and I walk them through the wireframes, sometimes I can gain a much greater confidence and I can convey an understanding to them of what I'm talking about much more quickly, right? Now, there's some flaws with that too, which is that maybe the specific embodiment I've come up with is a problem, or maybe they're making assumptions around the edges for the things that they can't see that are not there actually, or not part of the assumption. But I have found that wireframes can be used prior to engineering to do validation. So I would consider that part of the discovery. Usually, again, like it's not great in discovering problems. The open-ended interviews are better for that, but for the validation piece of it, I would consider it part of that. But you're right, though, for the stuff that's in production, that's not discoverability. That's just testing whether stuff's working, right? I guess you could argue that that's discovering problems when it doesn't work, but that's kind of shady. Any other questions?
No, all good for now.
All right. So competitor analysis. So I usually use these Harvey balls like you see on the right. And I do this a lot. I usually resist though, like sort of like when you see that you don't have something and you see that everyone else has something, just like knee-jerk reaction adding that thing for the same reason I talked about earlier, which is I'm more looking to differentiate myself um, than make sure that I have everything everyone else has. That said, it does often provide context, right? So like we were getting a lot of customer requests for a certain feature. We started some work on it, and when we started talking to sales, they were not very keen on it at all. And I was like, I don't understand, right? So I started to do the competitor analysis, and it looks like our competitor has like seven other things in that area on top of the one thing we were talking about, right? So it's very unlikely that if we just add this one feature and we don't add these seven other features, it's going to move the needle at all. And so that can help me understand, okay, if that's an area of strength for a competitor, if I'm going to go in there, I should be at least there or better. And if I can't get all the way there, I shouldn't just get halfway there, right? So that the competitor analysis really helps me in terms of that. Sometimes it can also point to gaps that nobody else has. So if I have a feature idea or we're looking at a problem, and then when we look at the competitor matrix, no other competitor is looking at that problem. Um, it can really help me understand, okay, maybe I'm onto something that can help differentiate us. Um, so I think it's a tool in there, but it's not essential to it's not essential to it in a certain sense. There's probably a question that's out there, which is, okay, yeah, easy to say, but how do you know when something's essential or table stakes? And you need to have it even if everyone else has it versus when it's something that if you do it, it would be a fool's errand. And that is difficult to answer. There's like technically surveys that you can do, like I can't remember, it's like the Vin Westendorf method or whatever. We did that once. Again, it was like $25,000. So meh. But in general, like after you talk to people, you get feedback where they're like, well, I would need to have this, right? If they talk about it that way, then you sort of come away with, okay, I need to have that even if I don't want to, right? Uh, and I got one more
Yeah, there
before we
was,
get to customer interviews. Yes,
all right,
sorry.
one question in the chat, but I just wanted to mention that I think that's the first time I had ever heard of Van Westerndorp pricing analysis.
Well, it may not be right. I mean, it's something like that. I can't remember what it's
No,
called, but
I think it is right. I think I came across it in some research at a prior job and I was like, I'd never heard of this before. I think it's the first time I've like heard someone else actually apply it. It's awesome.
oh, in the wild, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. Do you use the competitor analysis matrix for features or problems to solve?
I use it for features. I know the new thing is problems to solve. I I haven't gotten my head around it yet because the problem with problems to solve is that usually like the problems that I get are I'm retroactively trying to fit them to the feature that I'm trying to build, right? So like when I talk to customers about open-ended problems, which I was going to, I'll skip ahead and go back. So customer interviews, I think they're great. I think they provide an opportunity to have a conversation and not just get a fact, right? So I do a mix of open-ended and closed-ended questions in the interviews. So the open-ended, like right now, we're going through all of our customers and we're doing sort of a check-in with them. And so some of the questions are stuff like what's working well in the product and with our company and what's not working well with the product and the company, right? So those are open-ended, but like limited to us, which is tricky because I'm not going to discover things that are outside the realm. But I find that to be better than completely open-ended questions. When I used to ask completely open-ended questions like, what problems can I help you with? Can we help solve for you, right? I got stuff like, well, we're having trouble recruiting people into insurance compliance because it's a boring industry. And I'm like, no kidding. And like I can't help with that, right? Or they would have all these other problems that like I don't have enough budget or like my cat left me. I don't know, right? But they were just too general, right? They weren't areas that I could actually work on. So I kind of stay away from those like too open-ended problem discovery questions, right? Um, Conversely, when they do tell me a problem, then I can follow up on it. That's when I can really understand. I get a good, greater understanding, right, of what's going on. So I can ask follow-up questions. I can also hear from their tone of voice whether it's a real problem or just like a fun problem or an interesting problem, but not like a business critical problem. So I find that the actual interaction, like verbally over the phone with them, is useful for that. Now, again, so back in the day for Hazmat Navigator, I did a bunch of interviews, but I didn't take great notes, right? And so then when the product got challenged appropriately, because it was a bad product, I didn't have great evidence behind the decisions I had made. So never again. Now I take really good notes, and I also, if at all possible, record the interviews, right? and then I summarize the report. So if anybody comes back and they want to understand what happened, I can go through all very methodically and provide the evidence. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm right, right? But it does mean that here was the thinking, and here was the decision, and here was the reasons why. So, generally speaking, the exercise you do is only as good as the evidence you can provide to the stakeholders. So I make sure I have really good evidence. I was onto something. What was the question, Hillary? I forgot now.
Features versus problems to solve, I think.
Oh yeah, so that relates. So then the problems to solve piece of it, like I try to keep that in general in the back of my mind. So for like broker Buddha, we solve getting insurance information from insureds more easily. But the problem with the problems to solve, like framework, is that there's a bunch of problems that you're going to come across, and I can choose which problems I'm going to go across, but usually I'm just retroactively fitting them into features in my mind, right? Like maybe that's just me because I'm old school or whatever. When I started, they had waterfall development. But like if I say I'm gonna go after a feature which is like directly helping solve the problem of brokers sending information to carriers, right? I'm gonna say I'm gonna go after that because I actually think I can build a feature that solves that, right? So I'm really just retconning the problem I'm going to solve based upon the feature that I think is tractable that I can do based upon talking to engineers and what the current system does and everything. So I kind of think I'm kidding myself, right? That's one of the problems I have with this one. So I'm throwing into this bucket like all these ones where you have a 2x2 matrix, right? Like you'll say, this area or this, if you have a multiple products, you'll say some of your products are growth ones and some of them are, can't remember what it is, cows or whatever. Or you'll say like some of them are in markets that are expanding and some of them in markets that are stagnant or like they're in the. But what I have found is that like number one, your frame on that is going to vary based upon your level in the organization. If someone's higher up than you and you have a product that you think is hot stuff, but they are looking at a larger span, whether it's outside of the company or within the company, and they're like, that's a hot product, right? Like you're not hot at all. You're just thinking you're hot, right? Then that's going to color how they categorize things. And in addition, since you always want to be in the stars thing, right? You're going to find a way to, present the data in such a manner. And indeed, I found that everybody does this across the whole organization. So I found them very useless for persuading stakeholders and or making a decision because almost all these frameworks get contorted to match what you wanted to do anyway, based upon other stuff like interviews and your understanding of problems or political pressure or whatever. So I kind of dismiss almost all of these exercises that I don't recommend doing them because they seem like a waste of time. But that's just my opinion. And I think that is it. So again, customer interviews, something I really recommend. Tickets and then usability testing once you have something that you want to validate. Any
Awesome.
questions?
Yeah, someone is asking if there is a minimum number of interviews that you do to confirm a problem.
Yeah, so my general advice would be it varies based upon the size of the investment or the risk, right? So if you're making a multi-year commitment to like do something that is not going to see the light of day and or you're not going to get incremental benefits that you can deliver until you get to the end of it, right? Like each piece of the feature is not really going to do you for until you get to the end of it, then you probably have a higher bar than if it's just a minor enhancement, which you might not even do any customer interviews because it's like one sprint and you're pretty sure it's a good idea. And even if it's not a good idea, you can just roll it back, right? So I think it has to vary with the size of the commitment. And that commitment can also be a risk commitment, right? If you're moving the company to a whole new area, even if the engineering is not so bad, the risk that it's a mistake or that you're going to tarnish your brand or whatever can be significant. So I think you need to do more research. That said, in general, like most decisions, I use the Jacob Nielsen, like 5 interviews sort of rule of thumb. I find if I can find 5 people and they all agree, then it's probably a pretty good decision. Whether they all agree that's a good idea or a bad idea, right? So.
Cool. And there was also a question, I think this is like a greater desire from the audience. If it makes sense to talk about this live, John, great. If something comes to mind, if it's more like, oh, let me think about some resources and share it afterwards, I'd be happy to include it in a follow-up. But the question was, would be great to share what notes or process we use in interviews. So just if there are any like resources that are go-tos for you when conducting customer interviews, that sort
This
of
is
thing.
going to be really embarrassing, but I use pragmatic marketing. So pragmatic marketing, so again, I'm old, so I took it like 15 years ago. And at that time, as a congratulations for graduation, they give you a bunch of templates, right? And I still use those to this day. So like there's win-loss analysis templates, there's interview templates, there's competitor, analysis templates. So I start with those and then I color them towards what I'm trying to answer, right? But like I use basically the win-loss analysis from Pragmatic for these current interviews. Again, they're not win-loss interviews, so they're different. But that's how I started. That's the basis, excuse me, from which I started from, and then I tweaked it because they're not win-loss interviews, right?
Nice, great. I have a question that's sort of like half formed in my head. I'll try to figure out exactly what it is. But as a product manager, I think like the ones that you've shared, I know you have kind of your go-tos that seem to be most effective for you. It feels like there are so many options for product discovery methods available to us. And when using evidence from these methods to communicate with stakeholders and convince them to make a decision, it feels like there's so many options. Like, is there a rule of thumb that you have, or like a best practice or guiding principle for deciding what the right discovery method is for convincing, communicating with stakeholders or convincing them of a decision?
Yeah, I wish there was. I mean, I remember early in my career, I would try to nail down the stakeholders and say, look, tell me what evidence would convince you one way or the other. And then I can go out and may not come back positive towards the thing, but at least I'll know that the effort is not fruitless. And they would never play that game. So unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I mean, what I will say is it's surprisingly effective with the interviews, right? You could argue, but John, that's just N of 5 or something, so why would it be persuasive, right? But I have found it is persuasive. If I go out and I'm not biasing the sample, right? So I'm trying to not just talk to people who previously had indicated that they were interested in that idea, which is a bad idea, right? Because then you're just validating the thing you already knew. If I send out a general request to sales saying I want to talk to customers in this profile, right? And then I come back with a bunch of stuff and I tell people, look, I talked to these customers, they're all very excited. I talked to 3 economic stakeholders. They said that this seemed reasonable within their budget for next year. I find that works, right? I think if it was major decisions, I probably would have to do research and like market studies or something like that. But that's what I've found to be useful. I do think, I mean, this is trite and perhaps obvious advice, but you often need to tune what you're going to say to the different parties, right? So if I'm talking to finance, it'll be a profit and loss or a business case statement. If I'm talking to marketing, it's like the business problem and how excited it is and whatever. If I'm talking to sales, it's evidence that they're going to be able to easily sell it and that it will help sales. If I'm talking to my CEO, it's because it was his idea anyway, right? So there you go, right?
Yeah, thank you. And then a couple more questions in the chat, and definitely keep them coming if y'all have more. Sorry, I just lost my spot. Anyone have experience or success, including you, John, when starting fresh, for example, in other words, not incremental improvements, with Teresa Torres or Tim Airbag's approaches?
So I do like Teresa Torres. I haven't heard of the other gentleman, and I don't think I've actually launched a product from whole cloth that was successful, unfortunately. I've done some incrementals that were quite successful, but they were building on something else. So I leave that to the group, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. If anyone in the group has methods that have worked well for them, I dropped a note that jobs to be done is one that I've used in a past role when kind of starting fresh, in the sense of we had an established product in an established market, but wanted to really grow and differentiate. So we use job to be done to kind of start from the ground up to say what jobs do our customers need to get done, and what is their satisfaction with their current ability to get that done using the tools they have available. And that kind of gave us a look at key areas of opportunity to invest in. But that could, it's different from other scenarios that the person asking the question might have had in mind. So if anyone else has suggestions, definitely drop them in the chat. And then there was one other question I see right now. How do you get people to talk to you? Finding the right people and getting them to agree to an interview is the bane of my product management existence.
Well, can you ask that person, like, what are their economic buyers?
Yeah, that was from Todd. Todd, feel free to either hop on, like unmute or drop it in the chat.
The reason I ask is because some people it's almost impossible. So like doctors and lawyers and stuff, like where their time is money, and that it's very, very difficult. You probably have to go on site just to like get time with them, right? Other folks though, like, I mean, it can be most of the folks I've worked with is just they love to have someone to chat with, right? So I mean, I'll usually send an email. It's helpful. When I got promoted, it was helpful because I became the director of product, right? Which is like, ooh. So, but I always say, this is not a sales call. This is an opportunity for you to get feedback that we're really going to use to help improve our products and services, right? And I'll send out like 5 of those, and like 1 or 2 will come back, and I consider that fine, right? I did incentives at one point in time back at Elsevier until they were frowned upon, but I used to give away free books. So if you have something that your company does that you can then give away, that's not really the cash value that you're giving away, that's useful. I have, broken down and done like Amazon gift cards, but I don't recommend that because I started getting people who I suspected weren't doing it for any reason other than the gift cards.
Yeah, and Todd, anything to add to that in terms of the context behind the question?
Well, I agree. It definitely does depend on the audience. Yes, some audiences are much more, willing to talk to you. Some aren't. It also depends. It's much easier with existing customers than if you're doing fresh research where they don't really know you.
Yeah, who are you trying to talk to, Todd?
I've done it in a variety of audiences. I'm thinking I did nursing homes. I did a project that was a little easier. I did technology buyers. That was hard.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, I think that you're right. It depends. I haven't had problems with it in certain areas. In some other markets, it was really difficult. Yes. Sorry, I don't know if I can. That helps a lot.
No, that does. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, current customers are easier than straight prospects, but I just find I have to send more emails. You know what I mean? For prospects than for cross-selling to current customers.
Cool. Last call for some questions, and then we'll kind of wrap up and mention some housekeeping things at the end. We did have a question around who should be the target customer that you interview, and a kind of sub question there about the tone you use when speaking to customers.
So the target customer interview depends. If it's a usability thing and it's like a user enhancement, user, then it's a user, right? But if it's more of a new product or something that has a purchasing decision, then I aim for economic buyers. That is, people who have indicated they have the purchasing authority, or the people whose title would indicate that, right? So it depends on the question. Pricing is always very, very tricky. The vast majority of the time I ask around pricing, people sort of say, well, I can't possibly make a decision until you show me the product and it's been launched. But occasionally I've gotten lucky, so anyway, that would be my answer to that.
Got it.
Oh, and then tone. Yeah. So a mistake I made once, I talked to a market research professional. I was like, how should you do this? And they're like, well, make it very clear to somebody that it's not about you, right? You're not going to be offended. So I went into a call and I said, it's not about me. I'm not going to be offended. And I've never gotten more positive feedback about the product idea. And I'm like, what the hell? Because by saying that, right, I'd biased them to think that I could be offended. And so they overreacted and gave me positive feedback about the product idea. So instead, I just go into it like I'm the most bored person in the world, right? Like they're like, your product's a piece of crap and I would never use it. And I'm like, interesting, tell me more, right? Like I just go into it with that attitude of like, I'm just doing a job. It's actually not about me. Some other guy wanted it to be done, right? And that's generally the attitude I've found to be most effective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And it's usually my idea, by the way, just to make clear what I'm talking about. So. Great. Anything
There
else, Hillary?
Not at the moment. There is a common question that we get all the time, which is, will this be recorded and shared? Yes, we've been recording. We will share it to our, we have a BPMA YouTube channel, and then we embed that within a page on the BPMA website. And then after this event will also be, our team will send a follow-up email in the next day or two with a link to the recording. And there's been tons of great resources and tips and all that in the chat that I'll pull out and kind of turn into a list included in the email. Thank you all for sharing all of those. And thank you, John, so much for your time today. This has been amazing. My last request here is just, I dropped it in the chat. There's a survey through Google Forms that we use. It's just a couple of questions. How did you like the event? What would you like to see differently next time? Do you have ideas for future events? That sort of thing. We really use these responses to drive what kinds of future events we schedule. So definitely share your feedback if you could. But yeah, any last questions before we drop for the day? Feel free to drop it in the chat. But otherwise, John, thank you so much for your time and your insights. And I think another common question we typically get is, are you comfortable sharing a copy of the slides with everyone?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
And thank you for having me, Hillary.
Yeah, of course. We will include that link or a PDF version of it in the email as well. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your week and a good weekend and holidays. And yeah, we hope to see you next time. Thank you. Thanks, John. Bye, everyone.